So, hello to Sheye Abímbọ. So thank you so much for joining for this first Meet the Editors session. I'm going to ask you some questions about publications, academic writing. But first, I thought it would be good if you could just introduce yourself a little and say what you do and the multiple roles you have.
Thank you very much. I am Sheye Abímbọ. I'm an academic at the University of Sydney, where I teach global health and health systems. I am also currently the Prince Claus Chair on Justice in Global Health Research at Utrecht University in Netherlands, where I basically am developing a research program around ensuring justice and equity in how global health research is set up, and trying to think about designing enforcement mechanisms to make certain things not go wrong again. I also do research on global health and health systems broadly. I focus on governance, and my work ranges from community engagement in governance to decentralization and to the adoption and scale-up of innovations in health systems. What else do I do? I'm sure I do other things that I can't remember now, but that's who I am professionally.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. So you're, working for different universities in different parts of the world, and you're also the editor for BMJ.
Yeah, I forgot to say something. That was it.
So can you tell me what your role involves as an editor, and who else is involved in running the journal?
So the journal, so you can think of it as having an editorial kind of team and an administrative team behind everything. And so there's an editorial team that I lead, and that has me as editor-in-chief and about 10 different academics across a range of disciplines and interests as associate editors. We've now about to appoint a managing editor who will help coordinate things, because it's gotten too big for me to manage on the go. And so basically, when a manuscript is submitted, it first goes through the admin people who check that it ticks all the boxes in terms of what should go where, and references and formatting, etc. And then sort of sometimes there's a back and forth between the admin people and the authors, and when it's ready, it's forwarded to me, and then I decide whether it goes to peer review or not. Now, we receive about 120 manuscripts a week.
Wow.
And so that's quite a large number.
Yeah.
And we reject before peer review about 70-75% of that. So it's quite a large number that don't go to peer review.
Yeah.
But part of the way the journal works, the way that I've tried to make it work, is to optimize our systems for acceptance. So any manuscript that goes to peer review has 90%-ish chances of getting published, right? So we try to only take to peer review things that look very much like what will be published.
Yeah.
And there are issues there, but that's how we try to optimize the journal, so that we don't waste the time of peer reviewers and associate editors, etc. And of the sort of 25% that go to peer review, I handle about sort of half, a bit more than half of those, and the others are distributed among the other associate editors. And so that's how things work. And we invite peer reviewers, and then we chase them, and then they finally say yes, and then we chase them again, they finally send in the review, and then we make a decision whether to reject or major revision or minor revision. Extremely rarely, once or twice ever, accept without any changes at all.
Yeah, that's never happened to me. I've never had that.
I'm waiting for it to happen to me too.
So what are the main reasons that you would reject a submission?
So it's mostly a question of scope. So for example, a very clinical manuscript is submitted. Prevalence of atrial fibrillation at a hospital in Tanzania, that kind of paper. So it's mostly papers that are out of scope. Increasingly, we are also rejecting before peer review papers about which the authorship suggests that it's very parachute. Right? So if there's a paper about Tanzania and there's no Tanzanian author, or there's one Tanzanian author squeezed in between US authors, and especially if it's about a topic that is about systems and policy, you know that there's no way that either the authors know what they are doing, or even if they knew what they were doing, it would have any impact in Tanzania. We're very excited when we see papers from government people. That makes me extremely happy. If the Ministry of Health in Tanzania has written a paper, and 10 authors from the Ministry of Health, makes me very happy. So there's also a judgment to be made about along those lines. And in some instances, it's just because the method is not strong enough.
Yeah.
You know, a study, for example, I make this joke, it makes researchers angry, but I'm going to say it now. That I like to separate a research paper, a qualitative research paper, from journalism. And qualitative researchers hate to hear that. But for me, what that means is that it's important for the analysis to rise a bit above the data. I'm sure we'll come to this later in this discussion. I want to smell a bit of theory, a bit of something that allows that to speak deeply to the context, but also speak potentially to other places in a way that is abstracted enough for people to see what is similar to what's going on in other places. Yeah, and the same thing applies for quantitative work when it's very, very basic. And you could probably write it up in a commentary or write it up in a shorter piece of paper. Sometimes the topic is so interesting, I ask the authors to do that. You know, can you just turn this into a short commentary saying this particular point and point and point? So it depends on many factors, but those are the main reasons.
So that's so interesting because we have had lots of discussion about authorship. And yeah, actually, so I wanted to talk about your foreign gaze articles. So in our team, we one of the PIs circulated it. So the foreign gaze authorship in academic global health, and it's been sent to all of the ECRs. And you start off talking about, you know, what gaze and pose is. So you say we cannot talk about authorship without grappling with who we are as authors, who we imagine we write for, i.e. gaze, and the position or standpoint from which we write, i.e. pose. And I wanted to ask you, the first sentence of that article is, there is a problem of gaze at the heart of academic global health. And I wanted to know what you mean when you say that it's at the heart of global health. What does that mean? What implications does it have?
Thank you for the person who sent that article around, because I think that person did a lot of good. There's an assumption when we write in academia, global health being part of that, that we are writing for a very vaguely defined but implicitly global audience that is foreign and Western. And so when I, for example, study community engagement in a number of communities in Nigeria, and I write up the paper, whether I'm aware of it or not, I've been trained to write that paper for a white person somewhere in Europe or North America. That's my training, and that's what I do, right?
Yeah.
And when you read the literature, that's what is in the literature. We're writing for this audience that we don't even know, but we know that here are the kinds of things that this audience likes to read.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, I'm framing myself for someone else.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I'm also saying to myself, whether I'm aware of it or not, that my work is not for Nigerians primarily. And that is really brutal when you think about it. It feels sinful. I was raised in a Christian home, so sin comes to my mind very regularly. It feels sinful for us to do that. But that's what we do. That's how the literature works. And that's what I meant by that first sentence. Because I think it's something I've struggled to say because it's just so complex and in the air, and I needed to find a way to say it.
Yeah.
And in constructing that article, I had a few things in mind that I wanted to touch on, because it was a response to a growing, and it continues to grow, a growing discussion around authorship and representation. And when you think about the computer metaphor, I think of authorship as hardware, right? Things that you can hold and things that are tangible, you know.
Yeah.
But I think of what we actually do when we write as things that are much more difficult to hold, and sort of think of it in terms of software. What actually gets written and how it's written, who it's written for. And so there was a part of me that wanted to draw attention as well to these software things, that as we're talking about the hardware of authorship, which we can count, you know, nationality, gender, etc. We can count those. But what about the things we can't count so readily? And I was trying to say to people that if we want to reimagine what our literature looks like, we have to begin from imagining whom it is for.
Yeah.
And how we've constructed our knowledge infrastructure in a way that essentially is extractive. And until we try to grapple with that fact robustly, our discussions about authorship is just tinkering on the edges of the main issue. That was why I wrote it.
Yeah. So within the article, you make some concrete recommendations for how we can overcome some of this, which I think it's really interesting. And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I talk quite a bit about reflexivity in some of my papers. And I wondered, so you have a recommendation about people justifying their choice of pose and gaze clearly in a paper. You know, you say perhaps in a box below the list of authors or next to conflict of interest, which I think is an interesting suggestion. But I wondered, has anybody done this yet? And another suggestion later on is to extend the reflexivity so you justify why you're writing for a foreign journal. And you say, you know, because maybe it's because of funder expectations or for promotion. Has anyone done this?
No, not as honestly.
Yeah.
But I am currently involved in an initiative, and I hope it achieves this goal, in which a group of journal editors came together to design what a reflexivity statement might look like. Mm-hmm. And sort of, I think, about 7 or so questions that authors might want to answer. And we're trying to see whether journals will adopt it so that it becomes a mandatory component of each submitted manuscript. So there's some work going on to try and make that happen. So we're trying to see whether journals will adopt it. So certainly the journals that the editors who are designing this edit will adopt it. So BMJ Global Health will adopt it. We're still fine-tuning things, but essentially we want to run it as a pilot project. And we're beginning from much simpler places than what I proposed in that article. And we hope to refine as we go and include more things that are perhaps deeper and take us to a place of honesty more than where we're starting.
I think that's such a great idea, because I teach qualitative methods and I talk about reflexivity. So reflexivity as in, for me, you know, I work in violence against women and I work with perpetrators of abuse. So I would have to state in a paper, if I want to be honest about reflexivity, that I'm a woman of color, my class, that I'm a feminist as well as a researcher. And all of this really impacts on the way that I ask questions in an interview and analyze the data, and there's subtle ways in which I steer an interview. But there's never enough space in a journal article to do that sort of reflexive discussion, and it's always the first thing to get cut because the word limits and the page limits. So to have a place dedicated for that, I think, is really interesting and important. And within the countries we're working with, you know, we work in Sri Lanka, where there are 2 languages and 2 kind of cultures, in Nepal, where there's lots of different castes, you know, Brazil, which is a huge mix of different ethnic groups. And I think this sort of thing is really, really important because it's inevitably going to have a bearing on the data. Yeah. So, and I wondered, you know, are there good reasons to, are there any, so you suggest that in the authorial reflexivity statement, you can say why it is that you're writing with a, you know, a foreign pose and a foreign gaze. And one of the things that you say is that one justification might be that for that paper, the pose and gaze doesn't matter. Is there a time when it doesn't matter, do you think, or does it always matter?
See, I think that there are papers that are essentially written for from a global standpoint for a very global audience. So I'm here thinking about a paper that's written to influence WHO.
Yeah. Okay.
To influence the governance of WHO, and written by a bunch of very clearly recognizable elite global health people. Yeah, so there are papers that don't necessarily speak to a locality, or a local situation, for which it may be okay. But there are also, I mean, I give the example of the anthropologist who is foreign, comes to a place, recognizes there's nothing they have to say that is new to people who are local, and so choose to write as a foreigner for an audience of foreign people. And I think part of what I'm trying to get at also is the willingness to admit ignorance and irrelevance that we just struggle with. You know, there are spaces and times in which I just know that I'm completely useless. I know it, and I try not to pretend to be any more useful than I know that I am. Or where I know that I just don't know enough to be useful, even if people expect that I know enough. And I think we have a culture that does not allow us to be honest with ourselves and honest with our audience. And that's part of what I was trying to point out there as well. That I read many papers, and I know that those who have written it have nothing to say to the people about whom they've written it. They just don't know enough. It's just clear to me that these guys don't know what they're talking about. But perhaps someone else somewhere may have a few things to glean from there, you know, to add to their knowledge. So we have this. It's strange. The more I talk about the stranger it seems to me. It's strange that we have this knowledge infrastructure that is almost completely disconnected from reality. And you know, a friend of mine, I once complained to a friend of mine who said back to me after my complaint that, Shay, I think what you are saying is that the only decidedly colonial institution left is academia. Which is this institution that sees and decides that we are fine to just talk among ourselves and feel good and rub each other's backs and feel excited, and that's okay. So there's that in the work that we do, and I edit a journal, so I speak from a place of inside knowledge that we do have this system that we all prop up that is fundamentally problematic and needs a lot of reform.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, because some of the there's a lot of issues with publishing. So last year we had a workshop in Sri Lanka with the whole team, and what we asked everybody, what is your expectations for, you know, promotion? And we found that it's very similar across all of the country settings. So in Nepal, the researchers need three journals as a first author within 3 years to get a promotion. And it has to be a peer-reviewed indexed journal. And in Brazil, the researchers need to aim for an international tiered peer-reviewed journal. And so you talk about, you know, indexing, and you know, indexing being the journal being recognized as being like a leading scientific journal. So you talk about how actually local journals aren't always indexed. So that was going to be my next question, something about, do we just need to reform the whole system? Because right now as academics and early career researchers are having workshops on publications, because we're all judged on our publications. But yeah, is that the wrong thing to focus on, do you think?
Yes, what I think doesn't matter very much, does it? I think yes, I agree with you that what we are judged on, we're judged, and that's why the system exists and persists. It's that it's being propped up by incentive systems that are very, very archaic. I mean, these are very old systems. I have to make the point that academic journals began in the 17th century when Europeans, scientists, physical and biological scientists were trying to communicate because their numbers started to grow. They couldn't no longer have presentations in halls where everyone sits and there's everyone who matters on that subject is present. And so it was a way of communicating, and then it got standardized and there was peer review, etc. And there are two things that are different now, or that are different about global health that I think is worth noting. One of them is that a lot of the knowledge we generate in global health, and it's not the kind of knowledge that was being generated for which journals were created. Right? So the knowledge in journals at their inception were universal or universalizable knowledge. Right? So it's sort of the refractive index of a lens. It is the same thing whether it's in India or in Rome, right? It's the same thing. So there was a sense in which people were building a repository of knowledge that accumulates centrally, right? And that journals made sense. But when in the work that you do, there are so many deep contextual particularities that you just can't. It's not something you would readily generalize in the simple sense. If it's going to be generalizable, it will be generalized from the bottom up. In other words, you sort of assemble studies from many different communities in Sri Lanka or many different communities in South Asia, and you start to identify commonalities. But even at that point, it becomes much less useful. Once you abstract, the more you abstract, the less useful it is. In other words, the more central it becomes, the less useful it is. It's the other way around for what journals are created for, right? The more central it was, the more useful it became, right?
Yeah.
And I think we lose sight of that sharp distinction between those two things. That the original purpose that journals were serving is not the purpose that we are trying to force it to serve, especially in academic global health. Now, the second difference to my mind now is that we have information technology.
Yeah.
We have many different ways of communicating than they had in the 17th century. But we still write our papers as if we're writing them in the 17th century. It's the strangest thing. Sorry, I appear to be, but it's the strangest thing, right? That we still write papers as if it was 400 years ago. No other field does that.
Yeah.
No other group of people will tolerate that, but we do that. Right? So if we want to reform this thing, we really have to sit down and pick it apart and try and ask ourselves, what purpose is this serving, right? And how can we make it serve that purpose better? Now, we are stuck in the past, and we are trying to reify and solidify that past. And in doing that, we are doing a lot of injustice to ourselves and to our supposed people we are trying to support.
Yeah. Yeah. This is so interesting. And one of the recommendations you make is that people can, I love how you say that you learn about conversations through, you learn about information through local blogs, local radio, WhatsApp groups. And I wonder if this kind of, writing for local audiences in blogs or writing one article that does satisfy your promotion criteria, and also writing something local for a newspaper or blog in a local language. Is that something you would recommend that early career researchers start doing as kind of routine, as a routine thing?
Yes, but that only goes so far.
Yeah.
But yes, it only goes so far. See, the good way to think about this is to ask yourself, how does change happen in the NHS? It happens on radio. It happens on the front pages of newspapers. It happens in the parliament. That's how change happens. Change doesn't happen in the Lancet. Sometimes the Lancet gets picked up by the newspaper, but it's not the primary place. And somehow when we think about LMICs, we assume that it's different. Right? That is different in that change happens through the Lancet. Change happens in LMICs, on the radio, in TV. It's the same thing everywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a question that is kind of linked to what we have been discussing, and it's about theories. So some of our ECRs have found that they don't feel that their theories, so in Brazil, for example, and they have local theory, which doesn't really get accepted in big journals. So the question from one of the ECRs is, do you think that editors give preference to authors who submit manuscripts using the most prevalent theories in the world, which happen to be global north theories? Is that something you've come across?
Not personally, but my friends have.
Yeah.
And I've heard people talk about this. And I use theory in my work as well. And I think disciplines vary in how much they venerate old white men, mostly. And I think those who venerate them demand that. And if I have any advice, it is to look for journals that don't, and to write against journals that do. I feel as academics, I'm not sure which author, it was Audre Lorde or the one who wrote The Color Purple.
Alice Walker.
I think it was Alice Walker, one of them said Alice something Walker. About the easiest way for people to be powerless is to not realize that they have power in the first place. And I think we forget that we have power. And that we can shame powerful people and yell at them until they change. And I think academics don't do that enough. I mean, if 200 academics decide to make them change their policies, they will change it. You just have to write a statement, people sign it, and then keep republishing it. We can make change if we are sufficiently passionate about it. And I think, it seems I'm asking them to be activists, but if you really want your theory to be heard, and the journal rejects you, and the few people who have similar experience come together, write an essay describing what the journal has done.
And then a similar question, and from the same team, they have talked a lot about English academic writing. So I know that each journal will have a different kind of approach to this. So it'd be interesting to hear about your view as an academic, but also as an editor and someone who knows other academics and other editors. So do you think that in general editors consider like barriers to English academic writing when a manuscript comes from non-English speaking authors? And do editors generally consider these barriers, or do they just reject the manuscript? Like, what's your experience?
I think journals vary in how much resources they have for this and how they use their resources. So in the journal that I edit, if a manuscript comes through and it's not really well written, but peer reviewers can make sense of it, peer reviewers can review it and for content and not for language, we have a process through which it goes then to a copy editor who then smooths out the English and then returns it to us. I know not every journal has that. Some journals do that in a commercial way. So they essentially ask the authors to go through a service that they provide or that someone else provides and then pay $200 and then it gets edited, etc. Some research teams have English language editors. It depends a lot on resources and how journal policies work. But I don't reject any paper because English is bad.
So do you think this is a leading question, but do you think that journal editors' attitudes need to change to this in general? So
big yes, but I'm also aware that again disciplines vary in in academia, one of the markers of exclusivity is a journal choosing to only publish very, very few papers, or publish the most sophisticated blah blah blah. And there are fields that do that, right? And the more exclusive a field is, or the more exclusive a journal is, or the more or exclusionary, the more difficult it is to even have that conversation in the first place. So in economics, for example, in economics, people write papers for 10 years. Manuscripts spend 2 years at the journal, and that's pretty much normal. I mean, they are on the extreme of that. So in those places, you know that you just have to jump through a lot of hoops to even make it to any of the elite spaces. In global health, it's a lot more welcoming because it's a more applied field, and we are, even though we criticize ourselves a lot, we are still much more inclusive than most of the fields that I know of. Even in terms of who is an author, right? So the ICMJ criteria is quite inclusive. The same trial, for example, conducted by economists would have 2 authors. Conducted by global health people would have 15 authors. People have done the same things on each of them. But only 2 in economics can be authors. But in global health, everybody, So we are inclusive in that way. And our journals are less exclusive, although they are still exclusive, especially the elite ones. But again, it depends on the culture of a field, whether or not that shift happens. And I found that in places like economics or development studies, it's going to take many years for them to shift. In global health, I think it's much easier to shift.
So the ICMJ, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, we've had some discussions, and that's the framework we use. But there has been some discussion in the literature around, is that unfair, and is it set up to make it so that people in LMICs are never going to be the first author, because they, for example, they may not be able to approve the final copy of the manuscript because they don't have English as their first language, or don't have enough English to be able to read it. But they might be reduced to having like technical tasks, which doesn't really which doesn't make them eligible for authorship. So if they're just doing recruitment. So is this something you've thought about as well?
So I know people have different views on the ICMJ criteria. My view is that it's quite inclusive. I mean, it's not the best, but it's way better than how other disciplines think about authorship. Now, people who want to change it, I don't think they've thought deeply enough about the implications of what they are doing.
Okay.
Right. Or what they are proposing, right? Which is that there are 4 criteria, but three really, 1, 2, 3. Which is be involved in data collection or conception or design of the study. Second is be involved in writing or revising. Third is after the last version. Now, it's and for each of those 3. Right. And the reason why and is important, those who want to change it are proposing or, right? So if you tick one of those boxes, you should be an author. The reason why and is important is that and, even if it doesn't do that now, in the future, it constrains people to co-produce work, right? It's easy if I could be an author of a paper in which I helped design, but wasn't involved in the interpretive process that writing and revising entails, or in the ownership that signing off on the final version indicates. And I think it's easy to if we get the or that people are asking for, what we're also doing is basically saying you can pretty much leave LMIC authors out of engagement in those interpretive processes, which I think are the most important.
Yeah.
Right? You've collected data, you've analyzed data. What it means, what that data means, is crafted often during analysis and during writing. And if you construct a system that can exclude authors, supposed authors, from that, then I think it's wrong. I think it should be called something else than authors. Yeah.
Okay, that's an excellent point. I hadn't thought about that before. So just as a final question then, what do you think, or what do you hope the future of academic publishing will look like, especially in the global health space?
So here I'm going to predict. I'm going to predict that in the next 20 years, that there will be a mushroom, there will be a lot of local journals that will expand to take a lot of the space that journals like BMJ and BMJ Global Health and Lancet Global Health currently occupies. I think that those journals, or rather I hope that those journals, will not just reproduce the same old introduction methods results, blah, blah, blah. That those journals will reimagine what knowledge production looks like for their space, right? My first prediction is that there will be a lot of local journals. Second is that the way we should think about a research paper or a publication will change, partly because we changed how we think about how you present knowledge, but also how you transmit it. Right? So, for example, a study conducted in Zambia would likely be written in a structure that speaks to Zambian realities, and it's not trying to pretend that it's contributing to a global literature. Right? And when you write a paper for a Zambian audience, you write it differently.
Yeah.
Right? You write it beginning by not ignoring that it is for Zambians, right? Yeah. So you recognize what has gone down in Zambia, in the community. You recognize why this knowledge is needed, who needed it, who asked for it. You recognize who designed the research question, in consultation with whom, and then you write the data collection, however you write it, and then you write the analysis and you interpret it in a way, again, that speaks to the gaps that you're trying to fill in the local knowledge. You're not trying to plug some foreign knowledge. You're plugging. So how you think about what that paper does is really different. Yeah. And I think we have to take ourselves to a place where we can reimagine what that looks like. But that's our prediction. I think we're going to get there. But before we get there, we'd have to first get to a place where we local journals become more important, run by local people who know what they're doing and who have the same access to the global space. In other words, sort of the internet. So even though I'm publishing for Zambians in Zambia, anyone else can read it. But I know whom I'm writing for. Right? And I also know the format in which I'm writing it, such that, for example, I write a paper. There are YouTube videos at different segments of the paper in which I'm speaking to my audience in a different way. So I'm imagining something different here. And I think we have to get ourselves to a place where we at least imagine something else. Because I think what we have now is just not fit for purpose.
Yeah. I love that idea. I hope for that future as well. But yeah, so that's my last question. Are there any other things that you would like to add before we finish?
The other thing, which is linked to what I've just said, is that even now that there are shifts that we could start implementing now, even given our current constraints. One of which is just to try and stop pretending that we are writing for a global audience.
Yeah.
Or that we're filling gaps in a global knowledge. You know, if I want to write a paper knowing that people in the Ministry of Health in a state in Nigeria in which I've collected the data need to know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Not that there's a gap in the literature. I've done a literature review, and there's only knowledge in ABC country. There's none in an XYZ country, or it's not packaged in a particular way, and this method hasn't been used. All of these are very, very bad excuses for a study. And there are things we do because our system makes us do them. But I think we can rebel a little bit against those even now.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. This has been really great and I can't wait to share it with everybody. But yeah, please go and enjoy your evening now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.